Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust, and I am standing on the crown jewel of the Brandy Station battlefield. This is Fleetwood Hill. There's going to be a lot of action here that we're going to unpack for you as part of our 160th anniversary commemoration. Be sure to check out our earlier videos so that you can get up to the action that brings us here. Andy Pulton behind the camera has done a great job of shooting us all day long, editing, piecing this story together for you. We want you to share, we want you to like, we want you to follow along. We've got more action coming up today. But to help us understand this piece of ground that we're at, I'm going to ask my good friend Greg Mertz, Vice President of the Brandy Station Foundation, to come up and orient us to what we're looking at and where we're standing.
Thank you, Chris. Well, right now we are at the southern end of a ridge known as Fleetwood Hill. It's about a 2.5 mile ridge that mainly extends in the direction behind Andy and behind you all. But as we look at the ground in front of us, one of the things that you'll notice, several interpretive markers. There is a wonderful trail here to help explain the action that occurred here in this vicinity. There's also another tour stop a little bit further between us and the town of Brandy Station that helps to set up the approach of the Union Army to this particular area. As we look around a little bit further in that direction, peeping up just above the trees is a hill that is known as Pony Mountain. At the time of the Battle of Brandy Station, one of the 3 Confederate infantry corps commanded by James Longstreet was encamped around the base of Pony Mountain. And the purpose of Jeb Stuart and the large buildup of Confederate cavalry here at Brandy Station is to screen the movement of the Union Army as it goes up into Pennsylvania in what we know of as the Gettysburg Campaign. By screening, again, staying between the Confederate infantry and the Union forces, namely the cavalry, trying to learn what the Confederates are up to. As we go a little bit further around from Brandy Station, if you look very carefully, you can see a steeple of a post-war church sticking up above the tree line. You can also see some other buildings and some traffic moving around. That's in the area of the town of Brandy Station, less than a mile away from us. Sitting again at the along the railroad where some roads happen to go on across. As you move on over in this direction, one of the next important landmarks is an impressive brick building on the crest of the hill over there. The name of that house is Beauregard. At the beginning of the Civil War, the name of the house was Bellevue. And after the Battle of First Manassas, as casualties are brought down the Orange and Alexander Railroad to Brandy Station, where various hospitals are set up, Robert O. Wheat of the Louisiana Tigers recovered in that building and said that the name Beauregard, one of the generals in charge of the Battle of First Manassas, means the same thing as Bellevue or Beautiful View. So he changed the name of the house from Bellevue to Beauregard at the beginning of the Civil War. The man who owned that, his last name is Barber, his first name is James. James Barber would have also owned this hill, Fleetwood Hill. And if you read some of the first-hand accounts and read about the Miller House Hill, that's in reference to this particular ridge. The Miller House, the Fleetwood House, would have stood over right in the midst of all these interpretive markers here, and the Millers were renting the property from the Barbers. So that's a little bit of an orientation of the various landmarks in this vicinity.
Now, if you come up here yourself, you'll also find some markers to some of the donors who helped make acquisition of this property possible. There's a marker from the United Daughters of the Confederacy that are here. So there's some things to see and do. But one of the things that always amazes me is if you look at these signs along this trail that Greg mentioned, they're facing in a lot of different directions. That's because the action that takes place here is going to get wicked confusing. And to start talking a little bit about that, I'm going to ask my good friend Dan Davis to come on. I'm going to do the old-fashioned ABT mic swap with him, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the fighting.
Thanks, Chris, and hello, everyone. Before I get into the fighting, though, I want to sort of try to unpack some of the layers of history up here on Fleetwood Hill. We've been talking a lot about the Civil War, but there are also colonial connections to this area. sometime in the late 1770s, early 1780s, a fellow named John Strode is going to make his way out here from Fredericksburg, and he's going to build his home up here on the crest of this hill, and he's going to name it Fleetwood, thus lending the name to the hill that we're now standing on. John Strode had been working in James Hunter's Iron Works, part of the logistical infrastructure for the Continental Army that was located in Falmouth before moving out here to Culpeper. And in his time here in Culpeper, he's going to make friends with some rather famous individuals, namely Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States. Jefferson is going to come and stay with Strode during his travels between Charlottesville and Washington, D.C., and as well as Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson's personal secretary. Lewis is also going to visit Strode here at Fleetwood. Now, in the morning of June 9th, 1863, as John Buford's wing is moving across the Rappahannock at Beverly's Ford, David Gregg's wing, consisting of his own division as well as a division of Alfred DeFay, who I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes, is going to move over the river at Kelly's Ford, roughly about 6 miles off my right shoulder. Gregg is then going to make a right-hand turn and begin moving toward Brandy Station, where he expects to rendezvous with John Buford for the final push toward Culpeper, where they will ideally engage the Confederate cavalry. But as we know, the fighting has already erupted here along the Beverly's Ford Road, on the Cunningham Farm, and at St. James's Church. So when David Gregg arrives in Brandy Station, he's somewhat confused. He can hear firing off to the north, just beyond his line of sight, but they're expecting to, again, rendezvous with Buford. But Buford is nowhere in sight. Then all of a sudden, from the crest of Fleetwood Hill, he starts receiving fire from a lone Confederate artillery piece that starts lobbing shells down into Brandy Station. And to talk more about the Confederate resistance up here, I'm going to turn it over to Greg Mertz.
Thank you, Dan. Fleetwood Hill is where Jeb Stuart had his headquarters on the night before the battle. At the time that David McMurtry Gregg's forces arrived in the town of Brandy Station, Jeb Stuart himself has ridden up to the area of action around St. James Church. But since he's leaving his headquarters and realizes that people might be trying to communicate with him here on this hill, he left behind a member of his staff, Henry B. McClellan, along with several couriers that could communicate with him at the St. James Church vicinity. Henry B. McClellan is a first cousin of George B. McClellan. Henry McClellan was born in Pennsylvania. He, at a very young age, wanted to go into the ministry after graduating from college, and his family thought that he was a bit too young to make that very, very important decision. So convinced him that he ought to take a job teaching, and got a position down in Virginia, where he was when the Civil War broke out. So even though family has deep ties in the Union with his cousin in command of the Union Army, he joins Confederate cavalry. This is his first battle in which Henry McClellan is on the staff of Jeb Stuart. The man whose position he took was killed in the Battle of Chancellorsville, a man named Channing Price. So McClellan is up here, gets word that the Union Army has arrived in the town of Brandy Station. But McClellan realized that before Stuart left this hill to go to St. James Church, he dispatched several of his troopers to look after some of the less guarded roads. And so he turned to this courier and said, why don't you go back and make sure that you're not observing Confederate forces that we sent out there. The courier rode away and came back very shortly, pointing into the town of Brandy Station, telling McClellan he could look for himself to see that it was indeed Union troops in the town. So with that, McClellan sends back word to Jeb Stuart to let him know of the Union soldiers in the town of Brandy Station. And as Dan mentioned, fortuitously, he found a Confederate cannon coming to the rear that was either low on ammunition, or one account said they had some imperfect shells, but there is one lone artillery piece that he can see to the rear. He calls them up here to Fleetwood Hill. While the hill was somewhat wooded, a few shade trees around the Fleetwood house, this cannon, Confederates didn't try to seclude it. They sat it out in plain view, lobbing shells into the town of Brandy Station. And some of the Union forces, looking at this impressive hill, were a little bit cautious, wondering if on the reverse slope of the hill the Confederates might have massed some troops. They could hear the fighting going on in the area of St. James Church, and were very cautious about just charging into the sound of guns. So very cautiously we have a Union artillery response. Eventually the Confederates run out of ammunition and withdraw the gun, and the Union Army will again eventually make a charge up in this direction that Dan will talk about. But at the moment, Henry McClellan, as his cannon runs out of ammunition, is very concerned. As he looked off in the direction of St. James Church, he saw the first Confederate unit heading his way. It's one of Grumble Jones's units, the 12th Virginia, commanded by a man named Asher Harmon. Harmon apparently, while ordered to this hill, had no sense of urgency. So when McClellan saw him approaching, McClellan rode down and told Harmon that he needed to charge. He needed to gallop up to the top of the hill, saying the Yankees will get there first if you don't charge. So to pick up the story from here, as we now have both Union and Confederate forces heading for a clash, turn it back over to Dan.
Thanks, Greg. Now, Greg also mentioned that Jeb Stuart establishes his headquarters up here the night before the battle. Now, we've seen a lot of high ground today in our videos. This is why Stuart is utilizing this terrain as his headquarters. This is the high ground. Most importantly, in this part of Culpeper County, this high ground could be utilized by a force defending the approaches into Culpeper Courthouse. So if I'm leading, like Alfred Pleasanton, John Buford, and David Gregg are on June 9th, 1863, if I'm leading troops over Welford's Ford, up on the Hazel River, at Beverly's Ford, at Norman's Mill Ford, at Kelly's Ford, all along the Rappahannock, Freeman's Ford on the Rappahannock as well, I'm going to have to come up against Fleetwood Hill, and I'm going to have to push a defending force off of Fleetwood Hill to get to Culpeper Courthouse. So this is critical terrain. And this is, as Chris mentioned, sort of the crown jewel of the Brandy Station battlefield. This is where we've seen dismounted fighting on the Cunningham Farm. We've witnessed mounted charges at St. James Church. This is the traditional cavalry battle. Two sides meeting up here on the crest, fighting hand to hand with pistols and sabers, slashing, shooting at one another at close range. Percy Winham's brigade is going to come up, be the first of the brigades committed by David Gregg, first of his two. He's going to come up out of Brandy Station and attack up here, and it's up here on this crest where they will collide with Asher Harmon, the 12th Virginia Cavalry, as well as elements, the other regiments from Grumble Jones's brigade coming off the field, off the St. James Church front, back toward this key area. 1st New Jersey Cavalry is going to be heavily involved in the fighting up here atop the ridge. Up here atop Fleetwood Hill. They're going to lose their commanding officer, a lieutenant colonel named Virgil Broderick. Broderick, incidentally, is going to be interred in the Culpeper National Cemetery, and you can visit his grave if you visit Culpeper today. Grumble Jones is going to be sending his men, his troopers, again from St. James Church back here to this area to engage Percy Winham and David Gregg. There's going to be heavy fighting down here in this valley between elements of Jones's brigade and Joseph Martin's 6th Independent New York Battery. And in fact, the Civil War artist, the historical artist Don Triani, has a wonderful painting of the fighting that takes place between Martin's gunners and the 35th Virginia Cavalry Battalion led by Elijah White. It's called White's Comanches, a nickname for White's unit. Grumble Jones is going to manage to hold on to the crest, hold on to Fleetwood Hill very briefly before, and I'm going to ask Andy to pan over off to the left, before Gregg's other brigade, commanded by Judson Kilpatrick, is going to come thundering up the hill toward us. Kilpatrick starts his attack roughly in the area where the modern Southern States gas station is located, moving up toward us, up toward where we're standing. But fortuitously for Stuart, more help is on the way as Kilpatrick moves up this ridge. He's going to begin pulling Wade Hampton's brigade off the St. James Church front, and Hampton's going to be riding cross country to engage Kilpatrick. At one point in time, Kilpatrick is going to order the 1st Maine Cavalry to charge from the area off to my left, up and over the ridge, and that charge by the 1st Maine will eventually clear the ridge for the Federals. But at the same time, Hampton's going to arrive on the field, and Hampton is going to eventually push the 1st Maine back. I'm going to ask Andy to swing all the way back around, because the 1st Maine Cavalry is going to, during their attack, move up toward Beauregard, where, interestingly enough, watching the battle unfold is Robert E. Lee. Lee is over in Culpeper Courthouse. He knows that Stuart is engaging the Federals, and he has come out himself to observe the action. Eventually, David Gregg is going to break off the fighting here. Now, again, this is several hours of mounted assaults, hand-to-hand combat between the brigades of Judson Kilpatrick and Percy Wyndham on the Federal side, and Grumble Jones, Wade Hampton on the Confederate side. But at the end of the day, the Confederates are going to hold this key piece of terrain. Now, as the day is worn on, Alfred Pleasonton himself has come across the river, set up his headquarters. He's been fighting all day. It's been a long, drawn-out fight, and eventually he's going to send orders to both Gregg and Buford to withdraw back across the Rappahannock. But we didn't talk about Alfred Dufay's division, the division I mentioned just a few minutes earlier. Alfred Dufay's division, in sort of the closing chapter, I like to call it, of the Battle of Brandy Station, is going to cross the Rappahannock River at Kelly's Ford with David Gregg's division. And Dufay is going to break off from Gregg, and he is out really to cover the Union Army's, or the Union Cavalry's left flank as they advance into Culpeper Courthouse. Now, Stuart's going to be apprised of Dufay's movement, and he's going to send the 2nd South Carolina Cavalry, the 4th Virginia Cavalry, south to the village of Stevensburg, and they're going to briefly engage Dufay's division along Mountain Run. And it's during this fighting that Stuart is going to lose one of his better regimental commanders, Matthew Calverth Butler. He's going to have one of his legs taken off by a Union shell, but Butler will later return to command of the cavalry, or command cavalry, in the Army of Northern Virginia. He'll be back in the field within the next year or so. Eventually, Dufay, who cannot seemingly break through at Stevensburg, is also going to break off the fight and move back across the Rappahannock, ending the Battle of Brandy Station and really ending the opening conflict of the Gettysburg campaign. And as you can imagine, the armies are going to return to Culpeper later on after Gettysburg in the fall of 1863. Most notably, in the winter of 1863-1864, Fleetwood Hill is going to be part of the Army of the Potomac's winter encampment prior to the opening of the Overland Campaign. On May 4th, 1864, the Army of the Potomac is going to break camp and march toward the fords along the Rapidan, Germanna Ford and Ely's Ford, and the following day they're going to engage Robert E. Lee in the battle, the first day of the Battle of the Wilderness. But at the same time, interestingly enough, United States colored troops will come to Brandy Station. Brandy Station had been the key supply depot for the Union Army during their winter encampment. And the 39th United States Colored Troop is going to be dispatched to Brandy Station to help clean up, sort of wrap up efforts, getting the wagons, getting munitions and food provisions out of Brandy Station and sent to join the rest of the Army of the Potomac. And then seemingly, after the USCTs leave, Brandy Station slowly fades from public memory until about 30 years ago in the late 1980s. And many of you all are familiar with this story I'm going to tell. There were two potential major developments here at Brandy Station to develop the battlefield. This was a battlefield that at one point in time we could have lost, if not for the efforts of the Brandy Station Foundation, as well as our friends Bud Hall and Church Boasberg. And it's because of their efforts, and your efforts as well, members of the American Battlefield Trust, that we have Brandy Station today to visit and to enjoy and to ponder and study the meaning of the battle here, and the opening of the Gettysburg campaign. And I'm sure many of you all are aware that next July, the American Battlefield Trust is going to make not only the battlefield here at Brandy Station, but the battlefield of Cedar Mountain a gift to the people of Virginia, to the Commonwealth of Virginia, to become a state park. We are happy that you've joined us here for our coverage of the Battle of Brandy Station in the opening phase of the Gettysburg campaign. Be on the lookout for more videos as we will be traveling to points north to cover the Battle of Gettysburg and the 160th anniversary of that pivotal engagement. Like, subscribe, share this video, and if you're so motivated, join the American Battlefield Trust. We could not have accomplished all that we have in the fields of preservation and interpretation without your wonderful and very generous support. So for myself, Dan Davis, Andy Polton behind the camera, our great friends Chris Mackowski and Greg Mertz, thank you for watching and thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education.